He was a drifter with no past. They told me to send him away. My husband promised me forever, then died. Every man since broke his word, but this drifter asked for nothing. I said yes. Then the blizzard came. I found him in the dark barn, my calf wrapped in his coat. He said, "I told you I'd take care of things." And he did. He was the first man to keep a promise to me. My name is Anna Caldwell. I was 34 years old and had been a widow for 2 winters when the drifter appeared at my gate. The Double Pine Ranch was my husband's dream, but after the fever took him, it became my prison. 160 acres of dry ground, 30 head of cattle, and a fence line that sagged like my own spirit. The town of Dry Creek had opinions about everything. Martha at the general store told me a man with no name was a man with something to hide. The sheriff said drifters brought trouble. My own brother warned me that a woman alone was a target. They all told me to fear him. I had learned the hard way that a promise was nothing but breath. Then the blizzard hit 3 weeks later, and I found him in the barn holding my dying calf against his own chest. He broke every rule I had built to protect myself. And before it was over, the secret he carried would unravel the biggest lie my husband ever told me. My husband Tom was a man who could make anything grow. He had hands that turned hard soil into wheat and a laugh that filled every room of this old house. We bought the Double Pine Ranch when I was 26, full of hope and the kind of love that made you believe nothing bad could ever touch you. For 5 years, we built this place together. He handled the cattle and the heavy machinery. I managed the books, the garden, the chickens, the small things that keep a life running. At night we'd sit on the porch and watch the sun bleed gold over the north pasture and talk about the children we'd have one day. Then the fever came. It wasn't a long illness. It was fast and cruel, and it took him in 11 days. I held his hand when he died. His last words were to tell me to keep the land no matter what. I promised him I would. But promises are heavy things when you're alone. 2 winters alone on 160 acres will teach you things you wish you never had to learn. The first winter, I lost 6 calves to a cold snap because I didn't have the strength to dig a proper windbreak. The second winter, a section of the north fence collapsed under snow and I couldn't afford to fix it. I sold off 10 head of cattle at a loss just to pay the property tax. The bank sent letters, friendly at first, then less friendly. I started skipping the Saturday market because I couldn't stand the way people looked at me. Widow Caldwell, poor Anna. The woman whose husband left her with nothing but a broken-down ranch and a pile of debt. A few hired hands came and went. One stayed 2 weeks, ate my food, and disappeared with a saddle and $100 in cash. Another promised to fix the pump but spent more time drinking in the barn than working. I learned a bitter lesson. Most men's promises are lighter than dust. Dry Creek is not a big town, fewer than 400 people, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's business. After Tom died, I became a project. Martha from the general store would stop by uninvited with casseroles and advice. The sheriff, a man named Clyde Barker, drove out to check on me more often than necessary. He'd sit in my kitchen with his hat in his hands and tell me a woman alone on a spread this size was an invitation to disaster. My own brother, Paul, was the worst. He lived 2 hours away in Billings but called every Sunday to tell me I should sell the ranch and move to the city. He said Tom was gone and I needed to be realistic. He offered to find a buyer. I told him no every time. So when the drifter showed up at my gate on a cold afternoon in late October, the entire town already had an opinion ready. I first saw him from the kitchen window, a man walking up the dirt road from the highway, which is almost a mile long. He didn't have a vehicle. He didn't have much of anything. Just a worn canvas coat, a battered leather rucksack, and a stride that was slow but steady. He didn't walk like a man who was lost. He walked like a man who knew exactly where he was going, even if no one else did. I stepped onto the porch with my rifle in my right hand, the barrel pointed at the ground. I wasn't going to be anyone's easy target. He stopped at the gate and didn't open it. That surprised me. Most people just walked right in. He stood there with both hands visible, shoulders square, not moving. I called out from the porch, "That's far enough. What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the barn, then the house, then back at me. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and tired. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, faded but still visible. He was older than me, maybe 40, but it was hard to tell. Some men carry years like a pack they can't put down. He said his name was Elias Reed. He'd been walking the high plains for 6 months looking for work. He'd heard in town that the Double Pine might need a hand. I told him the town sent drifters here as a joke. He didn't laugh. He just nodded like he understood something I hadn't said. "I'll fix your north fence," he said. "No wages up front. A bed in the barn and one hot meal a day. If I don't finish before the first real snow, you can send me on without a dime." I should have said no. Every warning Martha and the sheriff and my brother had planted in my head was ringing loud. A man with no history, no vehicle, a scar like violence, but the truth is I didn't have a choice. The north fence was down across 200 yards. I had heifers that could wander onto the highway. If I lost any more stock, the bank would take the ranch by spring. And there was something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Elias Reed didn't look at me the way other men did. There was no pity, no hunger, just a quiet patience, like he was waiting for me to see what kind of man he was before I decided. I said yes. He moved into the barn that night. The next 3 weeks were strange. Elias worked from sunrise to sunset without saying more than a few words. He fixed the fence post by post, pulling rotted timber out of frozen ground and setting new posts with a precision that told me he'd done this work before. I brought him coffee in the morning and stew at noon, and he always thanked me with the same quiet politeness. He never came near the house unless I invited him. He never asked for anything extra. The chickens didn't spook when he walked by, and I noticed the barn cat, a mean old Tom that hated everyone, had started sleeping on his rucksack. Animals know things about people. The town found out within days. Martha drove out with a load of flour and a face full of concern. "Anna, you can't let a strange man stay on your property. You don't know what he's done." The sheriff came next. He said Elias Reed didn't exist in any database he could find. No driver's license, no vehicle registration, no record of any kind. A ghost with a toolbox. Paul called and yelled at me for 15 minutes. He said I was being reckless and desperate and that if something happened to me, it would be my own fault. I hung up on him. But despite all the noise, something shifted inside me during those weeks. I woke each morning and saw the fence going back up, one section at a time. I saw the tools put away clean at the end of every day. I saw a man doing exactly what he said he would do, and I started to wonder if maybe I'd been wrong about promises. Then the storm hit. A blizzard that came down from Canada with winds strong enough to rattle the windows and snow so thick you couldn't see the barn from the house. I spent the first few hours locking down what I could, and then huddled by the wood stove listening to the wind scream. It was nearly midnight when I realized I hadn't seen Elias since the snow started. I pulled on my coat and my boots and pushed through the drifts to the barn. The door was iced shut, but I shoved it open with my shoulder. The lantern was still burning inside. And there, in the corner, I saw what he had done. My youngest calf, the one born too early and too small, was wrapped in Elias' coat and his blanket both. The calf was alive, breathing, warm. Elias sat in the straw beside it with no coat on, shivering so hard his jaw was clenched, his bare arms wrapped around his own chest. He looked up at me with those pale eyes and said, "I told you I'd take care of things." That was the moment I knew he was different. That was the moment I started trusting a man everyone had told me to fear. But trust is a dangerous thing. Because 2 nights later, when the roads cleared and the power came back on, I found something in his rucksack that I wasn't meant to see. A photograph, folded and worn. It was a picture of my husband Tom, taken years before I ever met him. On the back, in Tom's handwriting, were 4 words, "Find me at Double Pine." And beneath that, a name I didn't recognize. For Elias, my brother. I stood in the barn with the photograph shaking in my hands. My husband's face. Younger, fuller, with a grin I hadn't seen in the last months before he died, and on the back his handwriting, which I knew as well as my own. "Find me at Double Pine, for Elias, my brother." The man sleeping in my barn, the drifter everyone warned me about, was Tom's brother. Tom never told me he had a brother. In 8 years together, through dating and marriage and building this ranch, he never mentioned the name Elias. Not once. I had asked him once early on if he had any family. He said his parents were gone and he was an only child. That was the end of it. Now I was holding proof that my husband had lied to me, and the man he lied about was 20 yards from where I stood. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of me and a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands. Every memory I had of Tom was suddenly under a new light. The way he'd sometimes go quiet when we talked about family, the way he'd change the subject if I asked about his childhood, the way he'd stare at the horizon like he was looking for something he'd lost. I had always assumed it was just grief for his parents. Now I wondered if it was guilt. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I would confront Elias directly. No more secrets. I found him in the barn, already working. He was repairing a broken hinge on the stall door, his hands moving with the same careful precision I had come to expect. He looked up when I walked in. I didn't waste time. I held up the photograph. "Explain this," I said. He stopped moving. His hands went still on the hinge. He looked at the photograph, then at my face, and something in his eyes cracked open. It was the first time I saw real emotion there. Pain, shame, and something that looked almost like fear. He set down the tools and wiped his hands on a rag. "I was going to tell you," he said, "when the time was right." I told him the time was right now, so he told me. He and Tom were half-brothers, same mother, different fathers. Their mother died when Elias was 14 and Tom was 8. The state separated them, sent them into different foster homes. Tom was adopted by a family that renamed him and moved him across the country. Elias aged out of the system alone. He spent years trying to find his brother. He worked odd jobs, hitchhiked, spent months searching records, ran into dead ends. Then 6 months ago, he found an old letter their mother had left, a letter Tom had written to her from a foster home, mentioning a dream of owning a ranch called Double Pine. Elias tracked the name to Montana, to Dry Creek, to this land. He arrived only to discover that Tom had died 2 years earlier. "I didn't come to take anything from you," he said, his voice low and raw. "I came to find my brother. When I learned he was gone, I thought I would just leave. But then I saw the fence, the state of things, and I knew he'd want me to help the woman he loved. I wanted to believe him." The tears in his eyes looked real. The story made sense. But I had trusted Tom completely, and he had hidden an entire brother from me. If he could lie about that, what else had he lied about? I told Elias I needed time. He nodded and went back to his work, and I walked out into the cold morning air with my heart in pieces. The news spread through Dry Creek faster than a grass fire. Martha heard it from her cousin who worked at the county records office after I asked about Tom's adoption records. By noon, she was on my porch with the sheriff and 3 other women who had known Tom since he first bought the land. "A secret brother," Martha said, her voice tight with suspicion. "A drifter who shows up right when you're about to lose the ranch. You don't think that's strange?" Sheriff Barker was more direct. "Anna, if that man is Tom's kin, he might have a legal claim to this property. He might be trying to take it from you." I told them I wasn't sure about anything yet, but the seed of doubt was planted, and I could see in their faces that they had already judged him. That night, Paul showed up unannounced. He drove all the way from Billings. He was furious. "You have a stranger on the property who could claim half this ranch, and you didn't call me." He demanded to see Elias. I told him to calm down. He didn't. He walked straight to the barn with me following behind. Paul is a big man, former military, and he carried himself like a threat. He shoved open the barn door and confronted Elias in the middle of the tool aisle. "You think you can just walk in and take what my brother-in-law built?" he shouted. Elias stood his ground. He didn't raise his voice. "I don't want the land, I just wanted to know my brother." Paul laughed bitterly. "That's what they all say. Then the paperwork shows up and suddenly you own half of everything." He threatened to have Elias arrested for trespassing. I stepped between them. "Paul, stop. He's done nothing wrong." Paul turned on me. "You're defending him, a man you've known 3 weeks." The accusation stung. But I held my ground. "I'm not defending him. I'm asking for facts before we destroy someone." Paul left in anger, saying he'd handle it his way. The next morning, I received a letter from the county assessor. Someone had filed a query on the property title, questioning whether Tom had any undisclosed heirs. If Elias was truly Tom's brother and could prove it, he might be entitled to a portion of the estate. The bank had been copied on the letter. Within hours, a man from the bank called and said they were putting my loan into review. If the title was contested, they could call the full amount immediately. The trap was closing. I confronted Elias again, this time with the letter. "Did you file this?" He swore he hadn't. He said he wanted nothing from the estate, but the damage was done. Someone had weaponized his existence against me. Then Martha dropped a worse bombshell. She came to the house with a look of grim satisfaction. She had done her own digging. "I found records from Nevada," she said. Elias Reed served 4 years in prison. Manslaughter. He killed a man in a bar fight. My blood went cold. She handed me a printed article. The details were brutal. A fight over a woman, a broken bottle, a man dead. Elias had pleaded guilty. The man he killed was the son of a local rancher. The article called it a tragedy of violence and jealousy. I read it 3 times. The drifter who had saved my calf, who had worked my fence without pay, who had looked at me with such sad, honest eyes, had a past stained with blood, and he hadn't told me. I walked back to the barn with the article in my hand. This time my rifle was loaded. I found him standing by the stall, the same calf he had saved nuzzling his leg. He saw the paper and his face went pale. "I was going to tell you," he said again, "when the time was right." I asked him if the time was right now. He sat down on a bale of hay. He looked 20 years older. The story came out. He was 22 in Reno working at a warehouse. A man started harassing a woman at a bar. Elias intervened. The man pulled a knife. Elias grabbed a bottle. In the struggle, the man fell and a shard cut his throat. The courts called it excessive force. No priors, but the judge gave him 4 years. He served every day of it. When he got out, he started looking for his brother. He said he had carried the guilt for 15 years. He said he wasn't the same man who had killed someone in a bar. I wanted to believe him. But now I had the town, the bank, and my own brother telling me to send him away. And a part of me was screaming to protect myself. I told him to leave by morning. That night I sat alone in the dark living room, Tom's photograph on the table next to the Nevada article. 2 men I thought I knew. 2 different lies. The wind howled outside. And then just after midnight, I heard a noise from the barn. I grabbed the rifle and went outside. A pickup truck was parked on the road, its lights off. 2 men were pulling tools from the barn. I recognized one of them. It was the hired hand who had robbed me 2 years ago. He saw me and grinned. "Your drifter sent us," he said. "Said there's plenty more where this came from." And they drove off before I could raise the rifle. I ran to the barn. Elias was gone. His rucksack was still there, but the photograph had been taken from the house. It was lying on the hay, face up, with a new note scrawled on the back in fresh pencil. "I didn't do this, but if you believe them, I'll prove I'm not the man you think I am. I'll find out who's really behind this. Wait for me." The note was still damp with cold when I picked it up. Elias' handwriting was tight and deliberate, as if he had pressed the pencil hard into the paper so I couldn't miss his meaning. He was gone. The barn was empty except for the calf, blinking slowly in the lantern glow. I stood there clutching the photograph of Tom and the note, my mind a battlefield. If I believed Elias, I was betting what was left of my life on a convicted killer's word. A man who had hidden his past from me. A man who had every reason to want this land. But if I didn't believe him, I was choosing the same fear that had told me to send him away in the first place. And the thieves had done something strange. They hadn't taken his rucksack. They had emptied it, leaving the canvas shell behind like a discarded skin. Inside, they left a single item, a key, old brass worn smooth around the edges, stamped with the number 237. It didn't fit any lock on the ranch. I had never seen it before, but someone wanted me to find it. The question was why. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, turning the key over and over. By dawn, I knew I had to act. I drove into Dry Creek and went to the hardware store, the only place within 60 miles that cut keys. Old Mr. Hanson took one look and shook his head. "That's not a house key. That's a locker key, like from a bus station." Billings was 2 hours away. I left immediately. The whole drive, I kept glancing at the photograph of Tom on the passenger seat, the brother he never mentioned, the secret I was chasing. When I reached the Greyhound station, I walked straight to the wall of lockers. Number 237. The key turned with a click that felt like a gunshot in the silent terminal. The door swung open. Inside were 2 things. A manila envelope, yellowed and heavy, and a letter. I took them to the car and read the letter first. It was from Tom, dated 18 months before he died. The words were in his handwriting, but they were addressed to someone named Elias. The letter said, "I know I have no right to ask. I let them separate us. I didn't try hard enough to find you. But I'm sick now. The fever has been coming and going, and the doctors in Billings don't know what it is. I need you to know the truth before I'm gone. The ranch is half yours by right. Our mother told me before she died that she put both our names in a family trust. I never told Anna. I was a coward, but I'm telling you now. Come to Double Pine. I'll explain everything. My husband had been sick before the final fever. I never knew. He had never told me he was seeing doctors in Billings. He had never told me about the trust, and he had never told me he had found his brother and asked him to come home. That meant Tom had known about Elias long before he died. He had hidden all of it. I was his wife, and I was the last to know. The manila envelope was even worse. It contained a copy of a will, not the will Tom had signed with me at the kitchen table, the one that left everything to the surviving spouse. This was an earlier draft, written 6 months before Tom died, and it named Elias Reed as a co-beneficiary to the Double Pine Ranch. It had been witnessed by a notary in Billings, but never filed with the county. Attached to the will was a letter from a lawyer, a man named Gerald Cross. The letter advised Tom that acknowledging an estranged half-brother could complicate the title and might require a formal partition of the estate. The last line of the letter said, "Your brother-in-law, Paul Caldwell, has already contacted our office regarding his concerns about the property's future. He strongly advised against any changes to your current estate plan. Paul, my brother Paul, he had known about Elias before I did. He had known about the trust, the will, the doctor visits, and he had said nothing. All those Sunday phone calls telling me to sell the ranch, to be realistic, to let go of Tom's dream. Now they sounded like a man trying to close a deal he'd already set in motion. I sat in the car in the bus station parking lot, and the world outside the windshield blurred. My brother had been manipulating me from the start, and if he was willing to lie about a secret brother, what else was he willing to do? I drove back to Dry Creek with new questions burning a hole through my chest. When I got home, I didn't go into the house. I walked out to the north pasture fence. The section Elias had rebuilt stood straight and strong against the gray sky. It was the only thing on this property that wasn't falling apart. I knelt down and checked the post work. It was flawless. The kind of work that takes years to learn, not the work of a con man, the work of a man trying to earn something he never had. I touched the wire and made my decision. I wouldn't let Paul destroy Elias to get what he wanted. By evening, Sheriff Barker showed up again. This time he had a deputy with him and an expression that said he was done playing nice. "Anna, we're going to need you to come to the station. There's been a development." I asked what development. He said the 2 men who stole the tools had been picked up in Billings. They had confessed to the theft, but they claimed Elias hired them. The tools were found in his rucksack, which they said he gave them as payment. I told the sheriff that didn't make any sense. Why would Elias hire men to steal tools from a ranch where he was already living? The sheriff just shrugged. "He's a convicted killer. They do strange things." Then he added, "We also got a call from a lawyer in Reno. He says Elias Reed violated his parole by leaving the state without permission. If we catch him, he's going back inside." I asked who made that call. The lawyer, he said, was hired by Paul Caldwell. The trap was now completely visible. Paul had been tightening it from the moment Elias appeared. He had filed the title query to trigger the bank review. He had sent the thieves to frame Elias. He had leaked the Nevada record to Martha. He had made sure the law would treat Elias as a criminal the moment he returned. And he had done it all while pretending to be my concerned older brother. The worst part was, I couldn't prove any of it, not without evidence. The only person who could clear Elias' name was Elias himself. And he had vanished into the high plains with nothing but a promise to return. 3 days passed. The bank officially notified me that my loan had been called in. I had 14 days to pay $32,000 or the property would be seized. I called Paul. He offered to buy the ranch from me for a figure that was barely half its value. I told him I knew about the will, the trust, and his meetings with Gerald Cross. He went quiet for a moment. Then his voice dropped into something I had never heard before. Cold, calculated. Anna, you're in over your head. That land has value you don't understand. There's a mining company that has been waiting for years to get access to the mineral rights. Tom refused to sell. I told him he was being sentimental. After he died, I thought you'd be more reasonable. But you're just as stubborn. If you don't take my offer, the bank will take everything and you'll get nothing. The drifter is as good as gone. Just sign the papers. I hung up. I was shaking. Mineral rights. Tom had never mentioned mineral rights. He had told me the land was good for wheat and cattle and nothing else. But if Paul was willing to frame a man and destroy his own sister for it, there had to be something huge beneath the soil. I went to the county records office the next morning and pulled all the documents I could find on the Double Pine Ranch. The original deed, the survey maps, the water rights, the mineral claims. And there it was, buried in a file that hadn't been updated in 30 years. An old geological survey from the early 90s. It reported significant deposits of platinum and palladium beneath the North Pasture. The survey had been classified as confidential by a private company that had optioned the mineral rights from the previous owner. That company had never exercised the option, and the rights had reverted to the landowner. The company's name was Caldwell Resources Incorporated. My father's old company. Paul had inherited it. The magnitude of the betrayal nearly crushed me. My brother hadn't just lied about Elias. He had literally been waiting decades for this land to become available. When Tom refused to sell, Paul lost his patience. And then Tom got sick with a fever that came and went, that no doctor could diagnose. I started to wonder if the fever had been something else entirely, something Paul had arranged. That night I sat alone in the house with every light turned off except the one above the stove. I was surrounded by enemies disguised as neighbors, by a brother who might have murdered my husband, by a bank ready to swallow my home. The only person who had shown me any real honesty was a stranger with a scar and a past he couldn't escape, and I had sent him away. I had told him to leave by morning. I had listened to the people who told me to fear him. Just then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered, and a voice I recognized said, "Anna, it's me." It was Elias. He was calling from a pay phone somewhere in Nevada. He had found the witness, the man who was at the bar the night of the fight. He had a signed affidavit and a recording. The dead man had been hired to attack Elias, to set him up, to put him in prison. And the person who had hired him was Paul Caldwell. My brother had been hunting Elias for 15 years, trying to eliminate the only person who could challenge the mineral rights. He had silenced Tom. Now he was trying to silence both of us. "I'm coming home," Elias said. "Wait for me." Elias said he was coming home, and I believed him. For the first time since Tom died, I let myself believe a man would do exactly what he said. I didn't sleep, but I made plans. I called Sheriff Barker and told him I had new evidence about the theft. I didn't tell him about Paul, not yet. I needed him neutral until I had enough to make the charges stick. Then I called Rosa, the only person in town who had never once told me to sell. She agreed to help me set a trap. We would let Paul think I was ready to sign the papers, to finally surrender. And when he came to collect, Elias would be there with the truth. Elias arrived 2 days later in the back of a Greyhound bus that pulled into Dry Creek just after midnight. He stepped off wearing the same worn coat, but his eyes were different. There was no weariness in them now, only a quiet, steady fire. He carried a folder and a small digital recorder. He had done what he promised. He had found the man named Victor Hayes, the witness from the bar. Victor was dying of cancer, but he gave a sworn affidavit and a voice recording confessing that Paul Caldwell had paid him to start the fight that night, to pull a knife, to force Elias to react. The plan was to get Elias killed or imprisoned, to remove him from any claim to the family land. The mineral survey had been floating in Paul's world since he took over the company. He knew the platinum and palladium under Double Pine were worth tens of millions. And Elias, the forgotten half-brother, the rightful heir, was the one obstacle he could never tolerate. But the recording didn't stop with the bar fight. Victor also said Paul had asked him about other jobs, less messy ones. A slow poisoning that mimicked a fever, a mixture of heavy metals tasteless in coffee. Victor refused the job, but he knew someone who didn't, A man named Gerald Cross's assistant, the same Gerald Cross who had drawn up the secret will. I felt the floor drop out from under me as I listened. My husband was murdered by my brother for rocks in the ground. We moved fast and we moved smart. Rosa took the recording and the affidavit to the county seat and filed them with a judge that morning. I scheduled a meeting with Paul at the ranch, pretending I'd finally agreed to sell. We told the sheriff to be waiting nearby, out of sight. The bank was informed to pause the foreclosure while a formal investigation began. Everything hinged on the next few hours. Paul arrived at 3 in the afternoon, driving his black SUV with the tinted windows. He came alone, confident as always. He wore a suit and carried a folder full of paperwork. He smiled when he saw me on the porch. "I knew you'd come around," he said. "This is best for everyone." I led him into the kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd once sat with Tom and laughed at Christmas. I offered him coffee. He took it, and then I asked him one simple question. "Paul, did you kill my husband?" He froze, the cup halfway to his lips. His eyes narrowed. "What kind of question is that?" I didn't blink. "The fever that took Tom, it came and went for months. The doctors couldn't explain it. They tested for everything and found nothing, but they never tested for heavy metals. I found the pathology report filed by the coroner this morning. Strange, isn't it, that Gerald Cross's office had a toxicology screen done privately that showed elevated levels of thallium in Tom's blood just weeks before he died. A screen that was never shared with me." Paul's face went white. He set the cup down carefully like it might shatter. "You're insane. Grief has broken your mind." That's when the voice came from behind him. "No, she's not insane. She's just the last person you fooled." Elias stepped out of the pantry. He held the recorder in his hand and pressed play. The voice of Victor Hayes filled the room, describing Paul's instructions, the payment, the cover-up. Then the voice of Gerald Cross's assistant, a woman named Cynthia, who had come forward that morning as part of a plea deal, describing how Paul had paid her to falsify the title query and the parole violation report. Paul staggered back, his composure cracked. "None of this is admissible. It's hearsay, coercion. My lawyers will shred it." That's when Sheriff Barker walked in from the living room, his handcuffs already out. "I've heard enough," he said, "and the judge has already issued a warrant based on the recording and the affidavit. You're under arrest, Paul, for conspiracy, fraud, and the suspected murder of Thomas Caldwell." The arrest was clean. No struggle, no drama. Just a man whose empire of lies crumbled in the space of a kitchen conversation. As they let him out, he turned and looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't even hatred. It was sheer, cold disbelief that his little sister had beaten him. I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollow and exhausted and somewhere deep down relieved. Tom's death finally made sense. The shadow that had hung over my grief for 2 years lifted just enough to let me breathe. The fallout was swift. The bank withdrew the foreclosure once the judge froze Paul's assets, and the investigation into the title was closed. The will Tom wrote for me was reaffirmed as the sole legal document, but Elias and I had already decided we wouldn't fight about the land. The mineral rights were real, and the platinum and palladium were worth far more than any cattle operation. We negotiated a deal with a mining consortium that paid us a fair lease and a royalty. The ranch would stay a working farm, but now it had a future. The first check cleared the debt and then some. The town transformed. People who had whispered now brought casseroles and apologies. Martha wept on my porch and admitted she'd been wrong. Sheriff Barker shook Elias' hand. Father Thomas held a memorial for Tom, and for the first time the whole community honored the man they had loved without the taint of secrets. I stood at the grave with Elias beside me, and I finally said goodbye. Not to the husband I'd lost, but to the fear that had defined my widowed life. There was one last surprise, waiting in the same bus station locker where Elias had left the will. When we went to clean it out, we found a small box at the back, overlooked before. Inside was a letter from Tom, written the day before he died. He had hidden it there after mailing the key to Elias, fearing Paul might search the house. The letter said, "Anna, if you're reading this, then Elias found you and I'm already gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. I was scared. Paul is dangerous. Protect each other. The land isn't just dirt, it's your independence. I loved you more than I ever knew how to say." And at the bottom a postscript. "Let him stay. He's the only brother I had, and he'll keep his promises. I know that now. That night, Elias and I sat on the porch under the same maple tree where Tom had once dreamed of children. The north fence stood straight, silhouetted against a sky full of stars. I turned to him and said, "You told me you'd take care of things. You kept your word." He didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the land and then back at me. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time in my life, I believed a promise without reservation. The drifter at the gate had become the one person who would never leave. The seasons on the high plains don't wait for anyone. Winter gave way to spring, and spring turned the north pasture into a sea of green that stretched toward mountains still capped with snow. I walked that fence line more times than I could count, not because it needed checking anymore, but because it reminded me of how it started. A broken fence, a drifter, a promise I nearly refused. We often think that safety comes from locking the gate against strangers. That wisdom is fear wearing a more respectable coat. But I learned that the people you're told to fear are sometimes the only ones brave enough to tell you the truth. Elias didn't come to take anything. He came to give me back something I didn't know I'd lost, the ability to trust again. We didn't sell the ranch. The mining company paid fairly for access to a small section of the land, and the rest stayed as it always was: wheat, cattle, a garden that grew more every year. Elias took over the heavy work, but he never tried to replace Tom. He just filled the silence that had been there since Tom died. He told me once that he'd spent 15 years carrying guilt for a crime someone else orchestrated. I told him I'd spent 2 years carrying guilt for a death I couldn't have prevented. We decided to put the guilt down together. Some burdens are too heavy for one person, but between two, they become bearable. The town changed too. People who had whispered now waved when we drove through. Martha started selling our produce at the store without taking a cut. Father Thomas asked Elias to help rebuild the church roof. And Rosa, dear Rosa, got married in our barn the following summer, with wildflowers in her hair and a smile that lit the whole valley. She told me I had given her hope that love could show up when you least expected it. I told her love had shown up at my gate wearing a worn coat and carrying nothing but his word. And that was enough. There's a question that still visits me on quiet nights. What if I had listened to them? What if I had sent Elias away? The calf would have frozen, the fence would have collapsed, the bank would have taken everything, Paul would have won. But worse than any of that, I would have become the kind of person who judges a man by his scars instead of his actions. And that person, I realize now, was never who I wanted to be. Tom's last letter said that Elias would keep his promises. He was right. But he also wrote something else. Let him stay. I think that was Tom's real gift. Not the land, not the minerals, but permission to let someone new into a life I had been clinging to with frozen fingers. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. The people who keep their promises don't always look the way you expect. They don't always arrive with references and clean records and a history you can scroll through on a screen. Sometimes they come from nowhere, carrying nothing but a willingness to work and a quiet determination to do what they said they would do. The world is full of noise telling you to fear strangers, but the truth is, every person you trust was once a stranger. The difference is whether you give them a chance to become something more. Elias and I still sit on that porch in the evenings. The old maple tree has new leaves now. The scar on his face is still there, and so is mine, though his isn't visible. We talk about the calf that started it all. She's a healthy heifer now, with a stubborn streak I swear she learned from him. We talk about Tom and the brotherhood that should have been. We talk about promises and how the right ones change everything. If this story reached you, if it made you think twice about the people you might have been too quick to judge, then stick around. There are more stories like this one. Stories about second chances, buried secrets, and the moments when an ordinary person decides to keep their word against all odds. Hit subscribe and come back for the next one. You never know whose promise might be waiting at your gate.